common critique of politically engaged art is that gallery dwellers, concert goers, and theater lovers are of the same political inclination as the artists. Often known as preaching to the choir, the critique holds that art's power to challenge and persuade is rendered valueless when it is experienced only by people who already hold the same typically leftist ideas and sentiments being expressed. In this paper, I will suggest three distinct approaches to this critique. Most of the talk will be dedicated to the third, which is not yet, I believe, fully implemented. The focus of this talk is music theater and new music, with my own work serving as a case study. While other art forms will also be mentioned, this is clearly not a research into popular art, which establishes a different relationship to audiences. The phrase preaching to the choir, and its equivalent preaching to the converted, is defined as presenting an argument or opinion to people who already agree with it. In an artistic context, this means that the audience which a political piece reaches is made of people who agree with the political message of the work to begin with, and so cannot be persuaded by it. For example, Rousseau argued that an audience must have the same moral inclination as the artist in order to understand a piece's allegorical message. This echoed on through Sartre and Adorno. Adorno writes, Sartre's frank doubt whether Guernica won a single supporter for the Spanish cause certainly also applies to Brecht's didactic drama. Scarcely anyone needs to be taught the fabula docet to be extracted from it, that there is injustice in the world. Epic drama recall the American phrase, preaching to the converted. Art, for Adorno, can only tell its audience what they already knew. A sociological take on this critique would stress that while people could have been persuaded by a piece of art, they are unlikely to be its audience. This is due to an echo chamber effect that relates to our divided cultures and to the typically liberal, progressive, middle-class nature of audiences in some art forms. This has been stressed by sociologists such as Bourdieu and Denisov, as well as by my late-night panic attacks, and perhaps yours as well. I don't wish to add my voice to the long debate around these ideas. Instead, I would like to draw out some of the ways in which this critique can inform practices of political music theater and their theorization. When considering this widespread critique, one can freeze and give up on politically engaged art, and one can dismiss it altogether. But it is the possibility in between these extremes that are potent ground for artistic work. So the first approach to the choir critique that I'd like to discuss is expanding, trying to expand the audience or expand the choir, so to speak. This means accepting the critique at face value and trying to change it. One of the people who writes most compellingly about this is Martha Rosler in her Thoughts on the Audience. For Rosler, an audience is something an artist chooses. Unfortunately, most artists are very passive about this choice, a passivity that is built into the art world system. The audiences for each type of work depend not on the category, but on the content, including the form. The audience, then, is a shifting entity whose composition depends not only on who is out there, but on whom you want to reach with a particular type of work, and why. There is a generalized passivity in artists' relations to their audiences, however, built into the structure of the art world. Rosler suggests agency regarding the audience in 4 areas of the piece: the structure of the art world, and the content, form, and type of piece. Most of her article is dedicated to the question of the art world structure, rethinking and challenging the how, why, when, by whom, and where art is exhibited. Rosler believes alternative to mainstream exhibition spaces run by artists, activists, communities should be created and maintained in order to have control on the audiences we attract. Simple examples of choices we can make that will affect what constitutes the audience are the decision to call a piece an opera or a musical, choices of themes, styles, location, pricing, and so on. Anyone who has worked in a choir knows that a choir actually needs some preaching. Some form of communication among itself, that is, in order to sing powerfully and harmoniously. This is analogous to the second approach to the choir critique, that an art piece can have value when it works within a political community through a galvanizing effect. Martin Luther King explained in a TV interview, "These freedom songs serve to give unity to a movement, and there have been those moments when this unity could have occurred if it had not been for the unifying force of freedom songs and the great spirituals." While songs are a natural place to find this approach, it is prevalent in all art forms. Documentary filmmaker Avi Mughrabi said in a Q&A session after being asked about the purpose of his films, "Every community, including a political one, needs its art. There is no singular recipe or even finite list of recipes of how a piece of art can work politically in strengthening or forming a political community. It could be achieved through crying together, laughing together, learning, reflecting, challenging. It can lift spirits or question assumptions." To conclude, the second approach to the choir critique sees its role not in widening the audience and changing the minds of new people who can join the struggle, but rather as consolidating, informing, and radicalizing the minds of people who are a priori in some way close to the political view or movement. Okay, so up until now we had two pretty straightforward approaches to the choir critique. Doesn't mean that they're easy to do or simple or not meaningful, but they're quite clear, I think. The first was expanding the choir, trying to reach new people, to widen it. That means really listening to the critique and trying to change the thing that it points to. Then the second approach is saying, what can we do with art within a community? We're not trying to reach someone outside, but we're trying to do something inwards. This we call galvanizing the choir, working within it. Now I want to speak about a third option. I'm going to call this activating the choir. And for this, I'm going to suggest that we rethink what political art does or how political art can work. It seems that the covert premise of the choir critique is that politically engaged art is a form of persuasion, trying to move people from one political point of view to another. This then is rendered useless if our audience is on the right disposition to begin with. While artworks can conform to this model, it is a much too narrow reading of politically engaged art. Art can subvert, distort, distract, elevate, mobilize, jam, crash, make way, and so on. Art can speak, and it can also act. The last approach to the choir critique is closely connected to practices of art as activism that have been receiving more theoretical attention over the last decades. Yates McKee's Strike Art, for example, theorizes art and artists' role in Occupy Wall Street movement. Paraphrasing Benjamin, he writes of the artist as organizer, immersed in activist movement and using their skills for activist ends. According to McKee, artists in Occupy have reinvented art as a force of radical imagination and direct action. A recent and local example of the kind of art that McKee refers to is the BP Must Fall protest performance staged by BP or Not BP activist group. I've had the pleasure of taking part in this action, where in response to the BP-sponsored Troy Myth or Reality exhibition in the British Museum, a 3-day artistic occupation of the museum took place. The occupation included a 4-meter-tall Trojan horse that was snuck into the museum grounds, a 1,500 participant-strong mass action, people who took part in the creative workshops and talks, led by artists and by people from the frontline communities who are most affected by the crimes of climate crisis and colonialism. Finally, the 1,500 participants joined for a choreographed protest song, and some stayed for an overnight body part casting session in the museum's Great Hall.
This is the time we really need to kick BP out of the British Museum once and for all.
One could maybe ask if these pieces are art, but I think a more interesting question would be, what do these pieces take from being considered as art? What powers are afforded to an action by art, and what responsibilities it inherits from it? With BP Must Fall, as with many such pieces, I think the answer is creativity. Creativity and creative skills are the most important aspects of art to be used in such pieces. Reimagining what an action looks and sounds like, creating memorable communicative images and moments, and engaging all sorts of audiences with creative work. It should be mentioned that every protest is creative, just like every art piece is political, and every action could be read through the place that creativity has in it. In regards to the audience, BP Must Fall is an extreme example of the first two attitudes discussed above. It is a participatory performance that galvanizes a convinced audience, the protesters, while at the same time reaching a very wide audience of people who could be convinced, the museum attendees, staff, and finally trustees. These two audiences, the convinced and the wider, are then amplified by the press and social media, reaching millions of people. So we have both expanding and you have galvanizing. And you also have something else, which I want to go into more detail with another example that I think maybe shows it in a clearer way. So I'd like to reflect on another example, by no means better, but one that, though much smaller in scale, animates a different relationship with both the choir critique and art in general. For the last decade, I have been involved in the struggle of the Sumrin family, a family from the East Jerusalem neighborhood Silwan that is fighting against the Jewish National Fund's attempts to take over their home. This struggle reached a peak in late 2018 when a courthouse was expected to give out a highly consequential verdict on the case. While reading some old documents related to the story, I was inspired and infuriated with a twisted tale that was revealing itself, and decided to create a piece that tells it. A piece about East Jerusalem, settler aggression, and the JNF would only appeal to a very small left-wing audience. And while I wanted this audience to know the horrible things that I was finding out and to shape in their political understanding of the situation at hand, I wished also to do something that might somehow advance the struggle directly. Finally, I decided to write an oratorio using the Israeli law of absentee property, the biblical story of Naboth's vineyard, and documents from the court case of the house. Knowing that my audience is likely to be sympathetic to the cause from the start, I resolved to use this sympathy and stage the piece on the footsteps of the JNF headquarters in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, without their approval, thus turning the staging of the piece into a protest, with the people attending protesting by their very presence. From an activist point of view, the piece was successful in drawing a bigger crowd than any of the protests before on the matter, a few hundred people, and creating more and different press entrants than the smaller rallies. As I have some level of familiarity with the majority of the people who attended the performance in Jerusalem, though not in Tel Aviv, I can say with confidence that the audience was strongly left-leaning. Some of the audience members were from the Jerusalem activist scene, involved in this struggle or in others similar, and many were not. People who might have attended a handful of large rallies in their lives, but are unversed in civil disobedience. The fact that they did choose to come to this action could be attributed both to an interest or curiosity in the art form, and to the fact that an audience feels like a relatively safe way to join a mass. It could be argued that this piece, Custodian, created a much more conservative relationship to its audience than BP Must Fall. They only sit and watch. But if we accept Bishop's stand against the simplest binary of an active-passive audience and try to look at the role the audience is performing rather than the actions that they do, we might see this differently. Not only is the audience participating in civil disobedience by watching the piece in a place where they should not legally be watching it, it is in fact functioning as a crucial part in the piece's political and aesthetic operation. This has to do with what the action takes from being understood as art. Creativity, yes, but something else as well. The reason that the performers are not thrown out of the premise, for instance, is due to the audience performing as an audience, and thus legitimizing the action as an artwork rather than a mere subversion. Art functions in this piece not only through creativity, but also with what Benjamin refers to as art's aura and art's cultic value, the social values that are attributed to something for its being considered as art. This has to do with art being considered distinguished, but not only with that. Art is also important and speaks of important matters. It has a unique relationship to the truth. It should not be silenced, and so on. And so, the audience, by performing the versatile role of an audience, by dressing the way they do, sitting the way they do, listening, laughing, judging, losing and finding interest, applauding, and so on, are a key part of the piece. They save us from the security officers and police. They create much of the aesthetic tension between the space we're at and the thing that we're doing. They create the chamber echo in which the piece is amplified outwards, making the piece more interesting for the press and worrying for the heads of the JNF as well as the court judge. The audience's so-called passivity is an artistic direct action that is achieved thanks to their choir quality. Before I finish, I want to leave a lingering question. What is the importance of artistic decisions in activist pieces? Or, how do the content and format interact? Theorists such as Sontag have been insisting for many decades that content and style cannot be separated. And while that is very true from a theoretical point of view, it is of little consolation to the artist. The place in which we have staged Custodian was, no doubt, an aesthetic decision, and not only a content one. But is it the only decision that matters? In BP Was Fall, we were very concerned, for example, with the accessibility of the tunes, writing something that can be taught to hundreds of people in a short period of time. The clarity of the story was important consideration in Custodian, but there were nonetheless many other decisions of pitch, tempo, meter, staging, intent, and so on and so on. Do any of them matter? If the strength of the piece is lended by the performance of the audience, is a layered metaphorical imagining of a biblical story important? Though it is beyond the scope of this talk to answer this question in detail, I believe these choices do always matter. I'd like to just draw out a few thought directions on this. Firstly, a piece of activist art can still hope to achieve other things in parallel to being in direct action. It can still hope to galvanize or radicalize a community. It can still hope to express the artist's feeling or understanding or thought. And it can still try to experiment with things of artistic interest. Secondly, I think art's aura is something that is affected by a work of art. A laughing audience is different from a crying one, not to mention a sleeping one. Thirdly, the choices one makes in a piece will be echoed in its ripples through different types of media. And lastly, choices that are made in one artwork will have consequences on the way the audience comes to the next. I tried to show a few ways that the choir critique could be taken into consideration in the practice of politically engaged art making. These are not mutually exclusive, and this is not a finite list. The examples I have given are not prototypes, but case studies. Every artwork establishes its own unique relation to the audience, but comparing similarities and differences is, in my mind, beneficial. The last possibility discussed seems to me one with a potential that is not yet fully implemented and explored. I am well aware of the fact that art's aura, as well as its cultic value, are seen, rightfully, as problematic aspects of art's place in our culture. Some forms of art, including new music, are elitist and attract a small, well-to-do, politically progressive audience. As artists, we should work hard to change this, but we should also learn how to use it as a tool in the struggles for justice. Thank you.